Hello, and welcome to my Borderpolar podcast, Series 1, Episode 2. I'm Lynette, and this is a series called A Borderpolar Diagnosis. Episode 2 is called Understanding Borderpolar. In Episode 1, which was What is Borderpolar, I sort of defined borderpolar as a dual diagnosis of borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder together, comorbidity, and talked a little bit about the symptoms of each, a little bit about diagnosis and treatment, and it was just sort of an overview of some things that I'm going to go into more depth in the next several videos. So this one is called Understanding Borderpolar, and in this video I'm going to go through the 9 symptoms of borderline personality disorder in a little more depth and how they can look like, what they can look like and how they can manifest in real life. And then the symptoms of depression and mania of bipolar disorder, and a little bit about what they can look like in real life, and then a little bit about what it's like to navigate having both of these disorders at the same time, and a little bit about the flavors of bipolar disorder in a little more depth than the last video. So there's a lot to cover, and let's just jump right in, I guess. So the first symptom of borderline personality disorder, and again, these are as they're listed in the DSM-5 Diagnostic and Statistical Manual um, for mental health disorders, I think is what it's called. I'm not sure exactly, so don't quote me on that. But in the DSM-5, number 1, frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment, or a fear of abandonment often is what you might hear when you're talking about BPD. So what does this look like or manifest? How does it manifest in real life? So some ways that, and I'll show at the end of the video all the resources that I looked at. But here's from my own experience, from what I've seen, and that's how I gathered these, from my own experience, from what I've seen in the support groups that I've been a member of for the last year, and what I found online, and the different resources that I include at the end of the video. How do frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment look in real life or manifest in someone's real life? Sacrificing your needs for others. Struggling to maintain healthy relationships. And that can come in the form of the need for frequent reassurance from a loved one, forming unhealthy attachments with people who might not be necessarily good for you, the cutting off of loved ones sort of at the drop of a hat or at the perceived slight. It can result in overly intense and erratic behaviors in order to avoid abandonment. Self-sabotaging behaviors such as oversharing, misplaced anger, impulsivity, lashing out at loved ones, and a poor self-image are included in this imagined abandonment. And I see this a lot actually in the support groups that I'm in. A lot of people posting pictures of themselves stating that they're garbage or they're trash or they're ugly. And this both shows a poor self-image as well as a need for frequent reassurance, because you're definitely looking for someone to tell you that that's not true. But at the same time, it's clear that they feel that it is, but they desperately need someone to reassure them that they're worthy. And so that's something I see a lot of in the support groups. And then a heightened sensitivity to rejection. And unfortunately, that ends up, I'm sorry, my speech gets stuck sometimes. Unfortunately, that ends up being something that happens more often than you would like it because of the self-sabotaging behaviors that you might exhibit in order to try to avoid rejection or avoid abandonment. Actually brings right on the rejection or abandonment that you're so desperately not wanting to happen. That's what self-sabotaging means. Behaviors that are going to bring right on the thing you're fearing, the abandonment or the rejection. So if we can recognize these behaviors in ourselves and see what we can do to try and avoid these types of behaviors, then we might not have as much of a struggle to maintain those healthy relationships. And some of the tools that we explore in DBT can help with that. So I sort of divided the BPD symptoms into what it looks like and what it manifests like in real life, and then these secondary symptoms, which I'm going to use at the end to sort of show how the two facets of bipolar disorder, the mania and the depression, as well as the symptoms of borderline personality disorder, can sort of intermingle with one another and make it difficult to navigate exactly what's causing your problems. yet focusing on the symptoms is really what is going to be most important. So the secondary symptoms I included that go along with this first symptom would include those types of things that are more symptoms of how a person is feeling rather than what's translating into their life. So volatile moods, distress intolerance, extremes of anger and withdrawal, and impulsivity are all types of things that I included under this symptom. And we're going to move on to symptom number 2 now. Symptom number 2 of borderline personality disorder is a pattern of unstable relationships, characterized by alternating between extremes in idealization and devaluation. So you might have heard the term black and white thinking, you might have heard the term splitting. Both of these are both terms for dichotomous thinking, which is this thinking of things as all good or all bad, a complete success or a complete failure. And this comes out in several different symptoms in borderline personality disorder, and we see it here in this one spelled out right for you. That in these unstable relationships, you have a characterization of someone alternating between idolizing someone and then devaluing them. So that's what a lot of people refer to as when they say I split on my partner or I was splitting today, but it can actually happen in a lot of different contexts. So let's look and see how this pattern of unstable relationships with these extremes can look or manifest in real life. And remember, we're not just talking about romantic relationships. We're talking about friendships. We're talking about family relationships. We are even going to touch on work relationships and how that can affect your work life. So it can look like someone being extremely affectionate and doting one moment and then pulling away the next. And oftentimes this is in reaction to something that that happened that might have hurt their feelings or been perceived as a slight. Some sort of condescension or put down, I guess, in some way, where they feel like they were made to feel less than. So if someone brings you down, whether they mean to or not, it can cause sort of this split, this black or white, this change, and a change might go from being affectionate and doting to pulling away. It may also, at the bottom here, you can go from needy or clingy behavior or anger and fury, and these can be disproportionate to the event that's happening. So it also includes the extremes in emotions that you feel with borderline personality disorder. It's all very complicated with the symptoms. So it might look like being extremely affectionate and doting one moment and pulling away at the next. It might look like chaotic, intense, or conflict-filled relationships. And again, these can be romantic relationships or otherwise. From extreme devotion to extreme anger, or many short-lived romantic relationships. And this can also mean a lot of on-again, off-again romantic relationships, or maybe even friendships too, or even family relationships that tend to go from periods of not speaking to periods of being fine. Relationships might include accusations, anger, jealousy, bullying, control, and breakups. Now, a lot of the times when we exhibit behavior, it's difficult to recognize it in ourselves. And so some of these things, not everyone's going to experience all of these things. Remember, not everyone experiences every symptom of borderline personality disorder, but it's important to take a look at yourself and see if any of these things apply in your life and examine whether it has to do with any of these symptoms that the DSM-5 lists. It can also appear in terms of unstable work history or frequently quitting jobs. So if you're working at a job and it's the best job in the world, and then something happens and all of a sudden you hate this job and it's the worst job, then that is still a relationship that you have, whether it's a relationship with a human being or a relationship with an enterprise. So we have to be able to watch ourselves for that kind of behavior. And then if we want to look at the secondary symptoms of this pattern of unstable relationships, I included impulsivity. So that could be breaking a bond, it could be quitting a job, it could be just changing your mind about something or someone very quickly at the drop of a hat. Emotional instability, dichotomous black or white thinking, paranoia could be included in here. Feelings of isolation can definitely be a secondary symptom. If you're often confused about how you feel about another person, that can definitely make you feel isolated. And it can also cause feelings of non-existence because a lot of people with borderline personality disorder have a lack of, as we're going to explore, a stable identity, and that feeds into how much weight we put into our relationships with other people. And so if you're going from having a great relationship with someone and then something happens and everything turns dark and sour in that relationship, you can start to feel like you don't exist because there was so much of you that was wrapped up in that relationship. So these are some secondary symptoms that I included in with what can go on inside of a person as a result of this symptom of unstable relationships characterized by alternating between extremes in idealization and devaluation. Moving on to symptom number 3, identity disturbances. Markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. So I don't know if this needs further clarification, but when someone has an unstable self-image or an unstable sense of self, it means that they don't really have a concrete idea of who they are. And that can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. And I have some here, and there can probably be a lot more. But here's some things that I came up with from what I've seen, what I've experienced, and what I read in my research. So this identity disturbances can manifest itself in several different ways, including someone having frequent changes in their appearance and or interests. So someone dyeing their hair very often, um, sort of mirroring others around them in order to determine what they're interested in one moment or another, maybe their style of music or their taste in movies, or whether or not they're interested in sports or some other sort of entertainment, which leads us to adopting the interests, mannerisms, and style of others. So even fictional characters, this can happen with. I know for me, there are several characters on TV that I identify with and have make up a big part of my personality. I can include in that both Rory and Lorelai Gilmore and Jessica Day from New Girl, and all of the characters from Friends in one way or another. I have adopted their mannerisms into my life in one point or another, and it never really went away. Probably Joey Potter from Dawson's Creek as well. And I didn't know that this was something I was doing until I learned about these symptoms, and it made a whole lot of sense to me in my life when I did learn about this. Going through these symptoms in such depth was very eye-opening for me, um, in terms of understanding my own life and borderline personality disorder. Difficulty dealing with change is another symptom that goes along with this, and that has to do with the inconstancy between what you feel like you maybe would like to be as a human without knowing what you are as a human, having that lack of sense of self, um, and what you think other people think you're supposed to be or what society thinks you're supposed to be. And so living with this constant inconsistency, it makes change very difficult because you're already so unsure. So difficulty dealing with change can stem from this identity disturbance. Another side effect of it is a low self-esteem, low amounts of self-respect, and low amounts of self-care. And that might translate into things like unhealthy personal boundaries, um, or maybe getting mixed up in uh, people who aren't good for you again might come into play there. So working on self-care, self-respect, and self-love to increase self-esteem is very important if you have a borderline personality diagnosis. Um, it might translate into frequently changing jobs or frequently changing romantic partners. Again, if you're not certain who you are, it's very difficult to understand who you are in relation to your job or others around you. And so this can cause a lot of impulsivity and frequent changes in um, important life things like where you work or who you surround yourself with. It can also translate into feeling a loss of your identity, as I mentioned earlier, when a relationship ends, because you have so much of your own identity wrapped up in that other person that when the relationship is over, you might not feel like you exist or not know who you are anymore, um, even if you probably didn't know who you were while you were in the relationship either, but that person would now be gone and you would have to redefine if you can. Um, and then another side effect is temporary hyper investments in roles, value systems, worldviews, and relationships. So this might translate into someone changing religions. It might, often it might translate into someone um, getting very into something like well, anything, just getting very into some interest and then getting very into a different interest and then getting very into a different interest. But it's even with relationships, it happens that way. A lot of short-lived relationships that are very intense and very um, fast-moving, maybe. These are just some ways that identity disturbances can translate into your life. And if we take a look at the secondary symptoms to make it um, a little bit more broad into what kinds of things you'll be experiencing, you would include impulsivity, emotional instability, that dichotomous black and white thinking. You might think a lot about yourself when you're all good or you're all bad at any given moment. Feelings of non-existence, and then dissociation. Dissociation is something that we'll talk about a little bit later in more depth. The next symptom of borderline personality disorder is impulsivity in at least two areas that are potentially self-damaging. Some examples that are most seen are including spending, sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, or binge eating. There could be more. You could get more specific about spending and you could say gambling. You could get more specific about a lot of things, or there's a lot of other ways you can be impulsive, but they in at least two areas that are potentially self-damaging. And here are some of the big ones. And how can this look or manifest in real life? To get just a little bit more detailed than this, overspending or impulsive or unnecessary purchases, gambling, engaging in impulsive, reckless, or dangerous sexual behavior, and that might include, unprotected sex with multiple partners, or um, risking legal trouble, things like that. Abusing alcohol or other dangerous illicit drugs or prescription drugs, driving too fast or without care. Binge eating is pretty self-explanatory. Screaming at or threatening to harm others is another way impulsivity is going to show itself, and also quitting jobs suddenly would also be another way. There's a lot of ways that impulsivity rears its ugly head in borderline personality disorder from several different symptoms. But if we're talking about impulsivity from this symptom, in these two areas that are self-damaging, I would include the screaming at or threatening to harm others in there in some ways, because if you're going to get yourself in legal trouble by being aggressive, then that would also be self-damaging. Um, but we are going to touch on that more in another symptom. The secondary symptoms that I listed as being related to this impulsivity include agitation, elation, some different feelings you can have during the impulsive moments, guilt or remorse afterwards, anxiety, and again, emotional instability, which we're going to see in a lot of these, and that is a hallmark characteristic of borderline personality disorder, emotional instability. Moving on to symptom number 5. Symptom number 5, recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures or threats, or self-mutilating behavior. So more specifically, how can this look or manifest in real life? There's a lot of different ways that this can be seen, but it can include cutting, scratching, or hitting oneself, excessive piercings or tattoos, picking at the skin or the scalp, biting, digging fingernails, pulling hair, banging your head against the wall, telling others that you want to kill or harm yourself, and engaging in reckless behavior that could result in death, such as reckless substance abuse. I see a typo there. I'm going to fix it later, but right now it's going to stand. Reckless substance abuse, reckless driving, neglecting attending to medical issues that may be life-threatening. And these are some ways that I think people might not think about self-harm. But if you have a medical issue that's, is could be life-threatening and that you need to take care of and you're not, that's also self-harming behavior. And reckless driving is also in this same, it is sort of like suicidal behavior, because if you're putting your life at risk, you're not taking care of it, and it still, I think, would fall underneath this symptom if you're experiencing these types of symptoms as part of borderline personality disorder. And the secondary symptoms include things like anxiety, impulsivity, depression can be going on, feelings of worthlessness, emptiness, feelings of isolation, feelings of desperation, acts of self-harm, attempts at suicide, and their, again, emotional instability. Moving on to symptom number 6. Symptom number 6, affective instability. So it's a different instability due to a marked reactivity of moods. This have to do with moods reacting quickly. Intense episodic dysphoria, dysphoria being the opposite of euphoria, so a very down type of feeling as opposed to a euphoric feeling. Irritability or anxiety, usually lasting a few hours and only rarely more than a few days. So this is going to be a depressive, some depressive symptoms going on, and some mood symptoms going on. But it's different than your borderline depression in its length. But other than that, it's pretty, a lot of the symptoms are going to be the same, um, except that, well, let's go through these symptoms and see what it looks like in real life. In real life, this affective instability due to the marked reactivity of mood, so how moods can react very quickly. You might see inappropriate displays of anger, inappropriate displays of panic, inappropriate displays of fear, and inappropriate displays of agitation. And I read those all separately because it's very important that we realize that those are all different types of feelings: anger, panic, fear, and agitation. But when you see an inappropriate display coming from each one of those feelings, it might look the same. It might just be yelling, but it comes from a very different place. So all 4 of those feelings are going to be overly heightened due to this instability and this reactivity of mood. So usually this is happening in reaction to an event, or a perceived event, but it can occur spontaneously. You might be having a conversation and just it's the wrong moment for someone and they are reactive. Oftentimes there's difficulty calming down once reactive. So it's not the same as bipolar depression, but the dysphoria includes depressive symptoms. I want to mention that because I want to talk about this a little bit later. Um, Emotional outbursts toward loved ones or strangers, aggressive displays including hitting or throwing things, acts of self-harm or suicidal behavior or threats, and then erratic behavior that may be dangerous, such as reckless driving, physical or verbal altercations, or impulsive acts. So these are all things that have to do with this reactivity of mood. But the intense episodic dysphoria, that depression, um, encompasses all the same basic symptoms of the bipolar depression. That's what I want to touch on right there. But this affective instability due to a marked reactivity of mood can look like all of these different things, and oftentimes it's going to be a quick change. Um, it might be another way that you can look at splitting, depending on when it happens or how it happens. If someone does have a reaction because something happened and their view of a situation changed, then splitting would qualify here, or dichotomous thinking might be a reason for a reactivity of mood. Let's take a look at the secondary symptoms. Anxiety, impulsivity, agitation, anger, mood instability, depression, and emotional instability. Symptom number 7 of borderline personality disorder is chronic feelings of emptiness. Now, that might seem self-explanatory, but for someone who doesn't know what that means, I'm going to explain. And I can tell you that I've lived with this symptom from the time I can remember things. Um, before I, all of my memories include this. It's just a persistent emptiness, a pit or an ache in your stomach, similar to the one that most people experience right when someone that they love passes away. Um, and sometimes it's bigger, sometimes it's larger than other days, and other days it's smaller, but the pit is always there. And I didn't know that this was a symptom of the disorder that I had until I was diagnosed when I was 36 years old. But I had always lived with that feeling and not knowing that there was a reason for it. It includes such things, the symptom induces such things as a constant need for instant gratification. So trying to fill, sort of trying to fill that void, searching for things to fill that void. A lot of people will turn to things like sex, drugs, or shopping. Um, there's a disturbance in the relationship of the self that's inside with that of the outside self. So the pit sort of adds to the symptom of identity disturbances, in that it makes you feel almost like grieving for your own self all the time. I don't know if that makes sense. This chronic feeling of emptiness and this longing for wanting to know who you are supposed to be might turn you into having some kind of chameleon personality, which I talked about before, where you can emulate um, the mannerisms or moves of someone else. But it might be so much so that you're just sitting there watching a TV show and the character, and you're not in a great mood at all, but the character on the television is smiling, and then you find yourself smiling. Or the character on the television show is grimacing and you find yourself grimacing. That sort of chameleon, or adapting to behave like anyone that you've just met. You just meet a person and you just become their same person. This chameleon personality can be related to these feelings of emptiness, sort of like always searching for something to fill that void, or some sort of meaning or purpose, because you might feel like life doesn't have a meaning or purpose. So you might seek it out in being like someone else. You might lead to depression or uncontrollable crying, difficulty with motivation if the feelings are too intense, the empty feelings. I mentioned already searching for something to fill the void. And it might lead to overdependence on one's partner to meet all their emotional needs. This there's a lot of It's a very complicated type of feeling, and it's really hard to explain to someone who doesn't feel it. But these are some ways that I was able to write down how it might manifest in someone's life. Secondary symptoms I included, that it causes anxiety, it can cause impulsivity, feelings of worthlessness, feelings of hopelessness or loneliness, an unstable sense of self, depression, and suicidal ideation. The eighth symptom of borderline personality disorder is inappropriate, intense anger or difficulty controlling anger. And sorry, my speech gets stuck sometimes. This might manifest itself as frequent displays of temper, constant anger, and recurrent physical fights. This was one symptom that when I was first diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, I looked at all the symptoms and I said, yeah, that's me, yeah, that's me, yeah, that's me. And then I went to this one and I went, that's not me, I'm not violent. And then I realized that I'm angry, even though I'm not violent. I have constant anger, and I've tried my whole life to be a positive person on the outside, pretending, so that my anger didn't get out. And it did sometimes on my own when I was young. I broke things when no one was looking. And I punished myself. And even though I never really allowed myself to give that anger to other people, I definitely had what you would call borderline rage. I just didn't unleash it on anyone but me or my belongings. Other ways that I found this manifests in my life, or it may manifest in other people's lives, include an extreme amount of impatience, outbursts of anger, sarcasm, or yelling, intense feelings of anger, rage, or agitation, feeling like you might go over the edge. It might result in road rage for some people, throwing things or hitting things, frequent arguments with loved ones or even strangers, bosses, coworkers, family members, um, might lead to legal trouble or trouble in the workplace. It might lead to abruptly cutting off relationships, and a lot of that on again, off again romantic relationships that you see. And so remember that these intense feelings of anger, rage, and agitation, any inappropriate displays of anger, inappropriate displays, are going to be bigger than the situation should warrant. Um, so if you notice behavior like this in yourself, or if someone else notices behavior like this in yourself, and you really have to take a look and say, am I feeling this way, and am I exhibiting this behavior, and what am I going to do about that? So the secondary symptoms, I included anger, agitation, mood instability, anxiety, impulsivity, dissociation, which we'll go into a little bit more in depth later, but that can happen in these intense moments, and also rumination, which is fixating on one thought over and over and over and not letting it go. And that can happen as a result of this too. And then the last symptom of borderline personality disorder, which we're going to talk about in a little bit different way, is transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. So we're going to look at paranoid ideation by itself, and then we're going to look at severe dissociative symptoms by itself. So paranoid ideation, um, experiencing paranoid thoughts, is a psychotic feature that can happen in borderline personality disorder. Along with having paranoid thoughts, you'll experience anxiety and stress. You'll experience distrust. You'll feel exploited. You might feel isolated or like a victim. You might feel like you're being persecuted by others. You will, if you're experiencing paranoia, interpret body language, words, and glances either as hostile or as about you when they're not about you. You might think that you're being watched or that you're being spied on or that other people have motives towards you that they might not really have. Um, Paranoia might be a difficult one to recognize in yourself because you don't know when you're being paranoid and you don't know when you're trying to follow your gut. So sometimes this is a difficult one to accept that you have going on, or it's a difficult one to pinpoint that you have going on. But paranoia can happen, and it's one of the one of the scariest symptoms in my opinion. I've I've been there before, and it's difficult. It's very difficult. And let's look at some secondary symptoms of paranoia. Oh, my mistake. Let's look at dissociation. Dissociation can happen in a couple of different ways. It can happen in depersonalization, which is so dissociation is basically feeling like you're not experiencing the reality that you're in one way or another. So in depersonalization, you might feel separate from your body, as if observing your body from the outside or as if in a dream. In derealization, you feel detached from the external world, so you don't really feel like you're part of the world that's around you. Things look strange, familiar, unreal, unfamiliar, unreal. And then you might experience amnesia, where you forget or lose time. You might have identity confusion. Dissociation could come in the form of identity confusion and that inner struggle about who you really are and who you are in relation to others. So you might dissociate in some situations where you're experiencing identity confusion. And then identity alteration is a sense when you're acting like a different person. So you might dissociate and feel like you're acting like someone else. And I've experienced most of these in one way or another. And from what I've seen on the support groups that I'm in, dissociation is a very complex issue. It's a very personal issue, and it's something that people have experienced in a lot of different ways. It's kind of difficult to explain to someone who hasn't experienced dissociation, but those are some ways that it can manifest in real life. You might feel like when you're dissociating, you have an altered sense of time. You might experiencing not remembering how you got somewhere. You might just be at work and not remember how you got to work. You might have literal tunnel vision where everything is very blurry on the outside, but you can focus on one thing in front of you. Or you might have uh, theoretical tunnel vision where you're fixated on one thing in your brain, but nothing on the outside. That's the way that I've experienced it before. It's possible to hear voices. At that point, during dissociation, some people hear voices. You may have intense flashbacks during dissociation that feel real. Some people get a little catatonic or become immobile during dissociation. That can happen. And you may find yourself getting absorbed in a fantasy world that seems real and dissociating in that way. So there's a lot of different ways that dissociation can happen in the way that it can make you feel. Secondary symptoms of paranoia and dissociation include anxiety, mood instability, maybe some rapid mood swings, especially well with either one. If you start feeling paranoid, you might have a mood swing. If you start dissociating, you might have a mood swing. Feelings of isolation, feelings of non-existence, and thoughts of suicide or self-harm can definitely happen because of all the intense confusion that might be going on during those moments of paranoia or dissociation. So that wraps up the 9 symptoms of borderline personality disorder. And I believe the next slide should be the beginning of my bipolar notes. Okay, so we're going to talk about the depressive symptoms as they are listed in the DSM-5 first. And I'm going to go through them pretty quickly because I don't think that they need a whole lot more explanation. I feel like they're very self-explanatory. I'll talk about the ones that might need a little bit more. But a depressed mood most of the day, I will discuss what that means, as what depressed might mean in a moment. Um, Diminished interest or pleasure in all or most activities, significant unintentional weight loss or weight gain, insomnia or sleeping too much, so not being able to sleep or sleeping too much, agitation or psychomotor retardation noticed by others, so either a pickup or a slowdown in your movements. And we'll discuss that more in a little while. Fatigue or loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness or excessive guilt, a diminished ability to think or concentrate or indecisiveness, and then recurrent thoughts of death. And so you might have seen a lot of these symptoms already happening in borderline personality disorder in one way or another. But let's talk about how these depressive symptoms can look or manifest in real life. So what does that look like? Little to no motivation to perform daily tasks. So maybe not cleaning, maybe not little to no self-care, um, not being able to maybe not being able to even go to work. Uncontrollable crying. It could result in withdrawal from loved ones and friends, isolation. You might have suicidal ideation, thinking about death, thinking about suicide, difficulty focusing, that lack of concentration. Feelings of restlessness or guilt can be mixed in here, a decreased sex drive, over or under eating, and then like that psychomotor retardation, so moving more slowly than usual or talking more slowly than usual are all symptoms that can go along with depression, which all can be part of the same way that depression could look in someone with borderline personality disorder. It has more to do with how your moods change, um, and what your other symptoms are that determine the difference between the two disorders. Let's talk about the manic symptoms. An inflated self-esteem or grandiosity. So a very high self-esteem, grandiosity, feeling like you have, like you're really wonderful at something or just better than other human beings in some way or another. It could be as bad as feeling like you're godlike. Um, that has happened, that can happen. Grandiosity. A decreased need for sleep, so feeling rested only, say, after 3 hours, or sometimes it can happen where you don't sleep for a few days. Being more talkative than usual, or a pressure to keep talking. Flights of ideas or subjective experience that thoughts are racing. We'll call that racing thoughts. It has to do with just um, lots of different things coming into your brain all at once. And I I feel this so much all the time. And it's not that I'm always manic. I think it's also a symptom somehow of borderline personality disorder. So it's just my brain is always feeling racing thoughts. Distractibility, where your attention is easily drawn to something unimportant or irrelevant, as reported or observed. So whether or not you're noticing that you're easily distracted, or your loved ones are able to report that you seem easily distracted, or say your coworkers or teachers or whatnot. An increase, and this is still the manic symptoms, these are the last two as listed in the DSM-5, an increase in goal-directed activity. So something that has an end product or an end goal, in socially, at work or school, or sexually. Or psychomotor agitation, so non-goal directed activities, so like moving about in some one way or another, tics or fidgets. We'll talk about that more too. And number 7, excessive involvement in activities that have a high potential for painful consequences. So this is a little bit similar to one of the symptoms of borderline personality disorder. It lacks the descriptor of impulsivity, but you can see that it includes unrestrained buying sprees, sexual indiscretions, or foolish business investments. So there is some impulsivity mixed in here, without the word actually being included. So how can these manic symptoms manifest in real life? So you might start many new and grand tasks the more manic you are. A very high mood, those racing thoughts, increased energy, less need for sleep, irritability, maybe pacing, fidgeting. I've actually developed tics in some manic states before. In my eyes, I've developed tics in my cheek. That's happened in my most manic of states. Feeling very restless and feeling very agitated. Intensity of senses might increase, such as smell or touch, vibrancy of colors. I have experienced these things myself. Talking way too fast, and people might tell you you're talking really fast. Taking a lot of risks, it manifests itself in that way. And also, you might see psychotic features during a manic episode, such as delusions or hallucinations. Now, when you say manic episode, what is the difference between mania and hypomania, and how does that relate, and what does that mean? Well, manic symptoms are the ones we discussed, but to have a mania, a manic symptom, it's a manic episode, it should last at least 7 days, where a hypomanic episode would last only about 4 days or less. A manic symptom is going to cause severe impairment in your social or your occupational functioning. So in your social life or in your work life, it's going to damage it in some way. But a hypomanic episode isn't really going to impair it um, as it is. You might feel like it's impairing things, but you probably aren't going to have the same repercussions, because the manic symptom might necessitate hospitalization, and it may have psychotic features. But in a hypomanic episode, you never get that far. So if you have had hospitalization and psychotic features in a hypomanic episode, then you've had a manic episode, most likely. But that's how the psychologists differentiate between the two. If you look at this graphic here, um, there's a difference between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. Bipolar disorder 1 includes one manic or mixed episode. Bipolar disorder 2 does not include a manic episode and does include a major depressive episode, but I believe that both bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 includes a major depressive episode. But if you look at the graphs here and you see how bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 will both have depression, but bipolar 2's manic symptoms don't go quite as far as bipolar 1's manic symptoms go. So that's really the major difference between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2, is what the manic stages look like. And in the difference being that in bipolar 1, you go into a full manic episode, which includes those psychotic features and might necessitate hospitalization, but with bipolar 2, you don't have that feature. Um, a so I mentioned how bipolar 1 is characterized by mania and bipolar 2 is characterized by hypomania. Again, bipolar 1 can have psychotic symptoms, but bipolar 2 does not indicate those symptoms. And then just a little note here about different treatments. I haven't looked into this myself. Um, I've never had electroconvulsive therapy, but they use it for bipolar 1 disorder sometimes, but I doesn't look like they use it for bipolar disorder 2. As far as I know, bipolar disorder 1 can both be treated with medication and psychotherapy or cognitive behavioral therapy. But I don't know if electroconvulsive therapy is used for bipolar 2. But those are some differences between the two. And on this graphic here, um, you can see how to describe what a mixed episode would look like. So those original depressive features and those manic features that I listed from the DSM-5, having greater than 5 depressive features and less than 3 manic features would constitute a depressive episode. Having greater than 5 manic features and less than 3 would constitute having a manic episode. And then there's this mixed state, which I think I have lived in a lot of my life in a mixed state where I've had greater than 3 manic symptoms and greater than 5 depressive symptoms. I've definitely been in depressive states and I've definitely been in manic states, but I feel like that I have lived more of my life in mixed states than anything, and that might be because of my borderline personality disorder symptoms as well. But I think it's important for someone with bipolar disorder to focus on what your symptoms are and what you can do to try to balance everything out rather than I see a lot of people saying, oh, mania is coming, or oh, I'm manic, but they don't include what they're doing to keep themselves safe, or what they're doing to keep themselves stable in those moments. And it's important, yes, it's very important to know what's going on with your disorder. So this is just a little bit of information to be a little bit more familiar with the flavors of bipolar disorder and the different things you might be feeling and how you can discuss that with your healthcare provider. Now here's a graphic I created where I sort of took a lot of those secondary symptoms and I wanted to get a look at what is included in bipolar depressive symptoms, what is included in bipolar mania symptoms, what is included in borderline personality disorder, and how do they sort of overlap with each other? Because I watch people asking questions like, is this a BPD thing? Is this a bipolar thing? I've heard people ask, which is worse, bipolar or borderline personality disorder? And the answer to those questions is, if you want to know if it's a bipolar thing or a BPD thing, look at the symptoms from the DSM-5. But really, it doesn't matter if it's a bipolar thing or a BPD thing. If you want to know which one is worse, no one can tell you. I don't have one, so I can't tell you what one is like. I have both. And I can't tell you which one is worse. I don't know. Um, I feel, but I can't always tell you which one is affecting me. And that's why I wanted to create this graphic. So you could sort of see how interrelated a lot of these secondary symptoms are. So all the depressive symptoms of bipolar disorder can be also considered the same symptoms you might feel during different symptomatic moments of borderline personality disorder. And I don't know that there is a moment in my life that I haven't been symptomatic. In one way or another. It's a disorder that affects every aspect of my life, with my relationship with myself and my relationship with everyone else. And then there are a few symptoms that are included in the bipolar manic symptoms that may not be a part of borderline personality disorder. Um, from nothing that I've read has led me to believe that these symptoms are part of borderline personality disorder. Nothing that I've found. I can't tell you if they're separate from me because I can't separate the two. I have them both. But from what I understand, starting many new and grand tasks, racing thoughts, increased energy, less need for sleep, pacing, fidgeting, and tics, hallucinations, and delusions are bipolar disorder symptoms. They could also be symptoms of borderline personality disorder in a secondary way. I don't know. But I can't tell from the DSM-5 or any of my research that they are. However, irritability, agitation, impulsivity, and elation and restlessness, all part of the manic symptoms of bipolar disorder, are all also part of borderline personality disorder. And as you can see, restlessness is both part of bipolar mania and bipolar depression, and part of borderline personality disorder. Whereas the dichotomous black and white thinking, feelings of non-existence, the unstable sense of self and unstable relationships, emotional instability, paranoia, and dissociation seem to be all parts of borderline personality disorder and separate from bipolar. Now, if you were to ask me what's bothering you more today, I could never tell you. If you were to ask me where my guilt, anxiety, or depression come from, I couldn't tell you which one it is. If you were to ask me about my irritability, I don't know where it comes from. Restlessness, I don't know. What's important is this. Yes, learn about your disorders. That is important. But focus on your symptoms. Focus on what you're experiencing. Pay attention to your behaviors. Try to understand how your symptoms are creating your behaviors. Determine what your values are. That can be very difficult with a lack of sense of self and a lack of identity. For me, I've determined my values to be honesty, kindness, compassion, knowledge. I've started gathering what a list of what my values are. Because if I can't figure out who I am or what I'm supposed to be or who I'm supposed to be, at least I can determine what my values are, my core values, and try to live by those values. So determine what your values are and then work to live by those values. With these disorders, you really have to focus on self-love and self-compassion. It's not easy to do, but if you practice it, the feelings might follow. So focus on those things and use the tools that are available, the tools in DBT or other types of therapy. Use those tools. You might feel like a nerd doing it sometimes, but get used to those acronyms and incorporate them into your life. Your relationships will be better because of it. Your behavior will be better because of it. Another thing I've learned is to keep some gratitude in your attitude. No matter how bad something gets, there's always something to be grateful for. And keep that gratitude there. It's going to help to make everything better every moment of every day. Keep the gratitude in your attitude and keep your attention on your intention. If your intention is to improve, keep your attention there. Don't let your attention go to the negative and bad feelings. Let them pass through you, but keep your attention on your intention. Another thing that's really important as you're going through growth and recovery is that there might be people out there who aren't telling you you're doing a good enough job. There might be people out there who can tell you that you can do better. There might be people out there who can tell you that you're not trying hard enough. But you have to remember that only you know how strong you are. You know how hard your battles are, and you know if you are trying your best all the time. And that is the only thing you can do. The only thing you need to do every day is try your best. As long as you're doing that, and as long as you know that you're living up to the strength that you have, then don't let someone else tell you that you're not. All of these things are way more important than determining whether it's the BPD or whether it's the bipolar that's bothering you, or whether it's a BPD thing or whether it's a bipolar thing. This is where your focus needs to be if you want to get better. So what's coming up next? Episode 3 in my Borderpolar diagnosis series is going to be called What Loved Ones Need to Know. So this is going to be talking about friends, family, and coworkers, and when and what to tell them, how to do it, what resources you might give, things like that. Episode number 4 is called Navigating Your Brain. And for that, I'm going to go through and I'm going to find whatever I can that has been shown in science to be definitive as to why our brains work the way that they do with BPD or with bipolar. Both how the brain works, where the disconnect is, what's not functioning correctly, and the genetic components that are involved in both of them. Episode number 5, What's Next? Treatment and Recovery. I'm going to talk more about the different types of psychotherapy there are out there, a little bit more about some of the other options that people have for treating different symptoms in more depth than I did in the first video. And then in episode number 6, I'm going to tell you about my borderpolar journey. So a little bit about myself. As it relates to everything we've talked about so far in this first series. And then the next video series that I have coming up is going to be called The Borderpolar Parent. And I'm hoping to get one out at least a month. That's my goal. And in that series, I'm going to have 6 videos. What and when to tell the kids, what to expect while you're exploding, how to forgive yourself, how to apologize for your actions, what I wish I would have known, and lastly, value-based parenting. So that's going to be the next video series I come up with. I haven't determined what the next one's going to be, but I might do one on relationships. I'm not 100% certain yet, but if you feel like there's something that you'd like to learn about, go ahead and leave a comment for me, and I'd be happy to make another video. I did put out a little I started a BPD vocab series. I'll be doing that every so often, just including different terms that you might hear when you're talking about BPD or even bipolar if I come across any that seem important to include. And just a few other things that I've come up with in between the actual series videos. But thank you for joining me for this one. I have 2 pages of references here for you. They're a little bit long today, but I really do enjoy verywellmind.com. Psychiatric Times Positive Psychology is a great one. Psychology Today. And then I've got this second page of references for you here. And this includes information that I got for the video as well as the graphics that I used. So again, this has been Series 1, Episode 2, Understanding Borderpolar. And this is my Borderpolar podcast. Thank you for joining me.